I am Walter Hensley, 68 years old, and I built a chain of family hardware stores from a single rented storefront into a regional supply empire. Last month, on the anniversary of my late wife's passing, I asked my daughter to visit her grave with me. She said she had a work emergency. 2 hours later, I found her at a five-star hotel brunch, laughing with her husband and his mother, toasting with mimosas. They thought I was just a sentimental old fool who wouldn't notice. I said nothing. I simply paid the check myself, in cash, and walked out. That night, I opened my study, pulled out files I hadn't touched in a year, and began quietly taking my company back. Before I go on, tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever been lied to by someone wearing your last name, hit that like button before we start. The phone rang at 6:45 that morning, the day my wife Ruth had died exactly 3 years earlier. I sat alone at my kitchen table in the house we'd raised our daughter in, a cup of black coffee going cold in front of me. I dialed my daughter Claire. She was 34, my company's chief operating officer, and since Ruth passed, the only person I called family. "Dad," she said, before I'd even finished my sentence. "I can't today. We've got the Whitfield contract closing, and Grant needs me at the office all morning." Grant was her husband, vice president of logistics, a title I'd handed him myself 2 years back, because Claire had asked me to give him a chance. "It's just an hour, sweetheart," I said, "just to put flowers down, like we do every year." She sighed the way she used to sigh as a teenager when I asked her to unload the dishwasher. "I know what day it is, Dad. I haven't forgotten Mom. I just can't get away right now. Can we go this weekend instead?" I told her that was fine. Business came first, I said, and I meant it, or told myself I did. I had built Hensley Supply from nothing, arriving in this county in 1981 with $300 and a used pickup truck, sleeping in the back of that truck behind the old lumber yard for the first 2 winters because I couldn't afford both rent and inventory. I wasn't going to begrudge my daughter a closing on a contract. I told her I loved her. She said she loved me too and hung up before I could say anything else. I drove to the cemetery alone that morning, the same as I had for 3 years, and knelt in the frost to lay white lilies against Ruth's headstone. I told her about the store's fourth quarter numbers, the way I always did, like she could still hear me. Then I drove back into town, and because I didn't feel like sitting in an empty house, I stopped at the Magnolia Grand Hotel for a late breakfast. It was the nicest place in the county, the kind of place Ruth and I used to go for anniversaries. The hostess greeted me warmly. "Mr. Hensley, so good to see you. Are you joining your daughter's party?" I stopped walking. "My daughter's party?" "Yes, sir. They're in the private dining room. Reserved it about an hour ago." She smiled, assuming I already knew. Something cold moved through my chest, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather. I nodded and let her lead me toward the back of the restaurant, though I didn't need the guidance. I could already hear Grant's laugh through the frosted glass door. I stepped just close enough to see through the gap in the doorway without being seen myself. There was Claire, in a cream blazer, a mimosa in her hand. Beside her sat Grant, and across from them sat his mother, Diane, a woman who had never once, in 2 years, asked me a single question about Ruth. They had a table covered in pastries and eggs Benedict, and Diane was holding court about a beach house she wanted them to help her buy in Destin. "Oh, you two are just too generous to me," Diane said, patting Grant's hand. "Retiring next year and I'll finally get my view of the water." Grant lifted his glass. "We wouldn't be able to do any of it without Hensley Supply carrying us, that's for sure." Claire laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Dad still thinks Grant and I are slammed with the Whitfield deal. He has no idea what day it even is for us anymore. He's so wrapped up in the store he probably forgot Mom's own anniversary." The words hit me like a fist to the sternum. I had asked her that morning if she remembered. She had said she hadn't forgotten. And now, not 2 hours later, she was telling her husband's mother that I was too foolish to know my own wife's death date. Diane cackled. "He's sweet, Walter is, but he really has slowed down, hasn't he? Grant tells me he barely reviews the invoices anymore. Just trusts whatever's put in front of him." "He trusts me completely," Grant said, and there was something in his voice I didn't like, something practiced, which honestly makes things a lot easier. I stood behind that door for a long moment, listening to my only child laugh at the idea that I had forgotten my late wife, listening to my son-in-law brag about how easily he moved money because I no longer checked. I thought about all the mornings I opened that store alone at 5 a.m., so Claire could have braces, dance lessons, a paid-off house when she got married. I thought about Ruth in her hospital bed, 3 years ago, almost to the hour, squeezing my hand and telling me to take care of our girl. I did not go in and confront them. I did not want to give them the satisfaction of watching me lose my composure in a hotel dining room. I walked back to the front desk, quietly paid the entire bill in cash before they could put it on the company card, and left without a word. Let them wonder, later, who had settled their tab. I drove home in silence. The house felt enormous and empty in a way it hadn't in months. I sat in Ruth's old reading chair by the window and stared at the wall for a long time. I was not angry in the way you'd expect. I was calm, and that calm frightened me more than rage would have, because I recognized it. It was the same stillness I used to feel 40 years ago, right before I outbid a competitor on a property everyone said I'd never get. I picked up the phone and called Marjorie Whitcomb, our company's outside counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd represented Hensley Supply since before Claire was born. "Marjorie," I said, "I need a full financial review. Every transaction Grant has authorized in the last 18 months. I want it quiet. I don't want anyone in the building to know it's happening, especially not my daughter." There was a pause on the line. "Walter, is everything all right?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's exactly why I'm calling." She promised to have her forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Dennis Okafor, start pulling records first thing in the morning under the guise of a routine insurance audit. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't think about missing Ruth. I thought about protecting what she and I had spent our whole lives building. Grant showed up at my office 2 days later, unprompted, carrying a bag of donuts like some kind of peace offering. He sat across from my desk with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had nothing to fear. "Walter, I heard you stopped by the Magnolia Grand the other morning," he said, feigning casualness. "Claire mentioned it. We would have invited you, but honestly, we didn't think you'd want to be around Diane's chatter, not on that particular day." I studied him, this man I had promoted, mentored, trusted with the keys to loading docks and supplier contracts. "It's all right, son," I said, keeping my voice warm, letting the old fondness bleed through even though it cost me something to do it. "I understand family obligations. Diane's your mother. You have to keep the peace." Relief flooded his face, exactly the way I expected it to. "Thank you for understanding. You know how she gets." "I do," I said. "How's the Whitfield contract coming along? Claire said it was keeping you both slammed." A flicker crossed his face, so brief I nearly missed it. "Coming along fine. Should close by end of month." I nodded slowly and let him leave my office, believing the matter was closed, believing I hadn't noticed the way his eyes wouldn't quite hold mine when I mentioned Whitfield. I poured his donuts into the trash the moment the door shut behind him. I would not eat anything purchased with a guilty conscience. Dennis Okafor called me at exactly 6 the next morning, before the sun was even up. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had found something he didn't want to be the one telling me. "Mr. Hensley, I think you should come to the office. Now if you can." I met him in the small conference room upstairs, the one Ruth used to call my war room. He had a laptop open and a stack of printed statements 6 inches thick. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Over the past 18 months, Dennis said, Grant has authorized $412,000 in payments to a consulting firm called Bright Path Logistics Solutions." I had never heard the name in my life. In 39 years running this company, I knew every vendor, every distributor, every logistics consultant worth a dime in 3 states. "What do they consult on?" "According to the invoices, warehouse efficiency optimization and supply chain modernization." Dennis slid a folder toward me. "But there's no deliverables, no reports, no site visits logged, no consultants who ever set foot on our properties, as far as our security logs show." I opened the folder and flipped through invoices that read like they'd been generated by a template, vague language about operational synergy assessments and logistics pipeline audits. Nothing specific, nothing that would survive a serious accountant's glance. I had built this company by reading every contract line by line at my kitchen table until my eyes burned. This was an insult dressed up in professional letterhead. "Who owns Brightpath?" I asked. Dennis had already found it. "Registered in Delaware 14 months ago. Sole owner listed is a man named Roy Kessler." He looked up at me. "Diane's brother." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Grant's mother's brother." My son-in-law was funneling nearly $500,000 of my company's money to his own uncle through a shell company that did no actual work. There's more, Dennis said quietly, and something in his tone made my stomach drop before he even continued. I found a transfer that doesn't fit the pattern of the others. $15,000, wired directly from a BrightPath account to a private medical office 2 weeks ago. A geriatric psychiatric practice, not a supply chain consultant. I stared at him. Geriatric psychiatric. Why would Grant be sending money to a doctor who treats elderly patients for mental health? Dennis shook his head slowly. I don't know, sir, but I don't like it. I sat in that conference room for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me, some final piece of trust in my son-in-law crumbling into dust. I thought of Grant sitting across from me 2 days earlier, eating donuts and lying to my face about Whitfield. I thought about Claire laughing at the idea that I'd forgotten Ruth. This was no longer about a lunch I hadn't been invited to. This was something far darker, and I intended to find out exactly how deep it went before I made a single move. I called a man named Preston Duvall that afternoon, a retired federal investigator who did private cybersecurity consulting and had done quiet work for me once before, years ago, when a competitor tried to steal our proprietary supplier pricing. Preston didn't ask unnecessary questions. I told him what I needed, and he told me he could have answers within a week. For the next several days, I played the part I had always played, the steady, unbothered patriarch, while underneath I felt a war being quietly waged in my own chest. I watched Claire at the office, watched her greet me with the same easy affection she always had, and I wondered how much of it, if any, was genuine anymore. Preston came to my house on a Thursday evening, his laptop under his arm, his expression grim in a way that told me before he said a word that whatever he'd found was worse than embezzlement. Walter, he said, sitting down across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once taught Claire to do long division. I need you to brace yourself. He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was an email chain dated back nearly 4 months between Grant and Diane, with occasional replies from Claire threaded throughout. The subject line read simply, "Planning ahead." I began to read. Diane had proposed it first. She'd apparently done some research and found an old clause buried in Hensley Supply's original incorporation documents, drafted back in the 80s by a lawyer who'd since passed away. A clause allowing for an emergency transfer of controlling authority if the founding owner was formally declared mentally incompetent by 2 licensed physicians. It was meant, originally, as protection in case I ever suffered a stroke or dementia in my old age, a safeguard for the company's continuity. Diane had found a doctor, the same geriatric psychiatric office Dennis had flagged, willing to falsify an evaluation for the right price. I read Grant's reply. He'd written that he wasn't sure, that it felt wrong, that I was still sharp as a tack. Diane had responded within the hour, telling him not to be sentimental, that Walter was 68 and grieving, and would only get more careless with time, that this was simply accelerating an inevitability, that they deserved to enjoy the fruits of the company while they were young enough to enjoy them. And then I found Claire's reply. Just 3 lines. She'd written that she loved me, that this felt like a betrayal, but that Grant needed this to finally step out of my shadow, and that watching me grieve Ruth for 3 years had been hard enough without watching me run the company into the ground out of stubbornness. She said she'd support whatever they decided, as long as I was taken care of somewhere comfortable. Somewhere comfortable. I read those 2 words perhaps a dozen times before they fully registered. My own daughter had agreed, in writing, to help forge a mental incompetence diagnosis so her husband could seize my company and place me somewhere. Preston watched my face carefully. There's a facility mentioned 2 emails later, a long-term memory care residence, about 90 minutes north of here. Diane apparently has a friend on the admissions board. Private, restricted visitation, the kind of place families use when they want someone quietly out of the way. I sat very still for a long time. I had expected betrayal over money. Men steal from family businesses more often than anyone likes to admit, and I had braced myself for that particular wound. I had not braced myself for my only child agreeing to have me locked away in a facility so her husband could sit in my chair. There's a board meeting scheduled in 10 days, Preston added quietly. Annual shareholder review. It's mentioned in a later email as the target date. Grant plans to present the falsified diagnosis and invoke the incapacity clause in front of the full board. I closed my eyes. I thought of Ruth, of her hand in mine at the end, of the promise I'd made her to look after our girl. I had spent 3 years grieving my wife while trying to keep this company steady for our daughter's future. And the entire time, that same daughter had been quietly signing off on a plan to erase me from my own life. The grief that welled up in me was real, and for a moment I let myself feel it fully, sitting alone in that kitchen with Preston watching me with something like pity. But grief is a luxury, and I did not have the time to indulge it. I had spent 4 decades in rooms full of men who wanted what I had, and I had never once lost to a single one of them. I was not going to lose to my own son-in-law in a shell company run by his uncle. Preston, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. I want continuous access to everything, every email, every call log, every financial transfer, from now until that board meeting. And I want you to tell no one, not even Marjorie yet. He nodded. What's the plan? I told him. I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would become for the next 10 days precisely the fragile, forgetful old man they already believed me to be. I would hand them enough rope that they would tie their own hands with it. And when the board meeting came, I would let them walk into that room fully convinced they had already won. I began the following Monday. I arrived at the office late, uncharacteristically, and told my longtime office manager, Linda, that I'd lost track of time. I asked her, twice within the same hour, whether we'd finalized the spring inventory order, watching her exchange a small, worried glance with the receptionist. By Wednesday, word had clearly reached Grant, because he began stopping by my office more frequently, always with some small, unnecessary kindness, always watching me with the careful, assessing eyes of a man measuring how much further I had slipped. I left the door to our old safe cracked open one afternoon, filled with nothing more sensitive than expired warranty paperwork, and watched from the corner of my eye as Grant's gaze lingered on it a beat too long when he came in to drop off a folder. I began calling him son in a tone just slightly too warm, too grateful, the tone of a man desperate for his family's approval. I misplaced a supplier contract on purpose and apologized to the whole staff over email, an apology dripping with embarrassment I did not actually feel. Preston's surveillance confirmed it was working. Late one night, he brought me a transcript of a call between Grant and Claire. Grant told her the old man was deteriorating faster than they'd expected, that it was almost sad to watch, and Claire had laughed, a small guilty laugh, and said maybe it was for the best, that Dad wouldn't even remember enough to be upset once it was done. I read that transcript standing in my kitchen at midnight, and something in me went very quiet and very cold. Whatever soft hope I'd been holding on to, that this was somehow all Diane's doing and Grant's weakness, that Claire could still be pulled back from it, finally died. On the 7th day, I called Grant into my office and told him I needed to speak with him about the future of the company. I made my voice tremble slightly. I told him I'd been thinking, that maybe it was time to start transitioning more responsibility to him, that I wanted to make a gesture of good faith before things got, as I put it, harder for me. His eyes lit up in a way he couldn't fully hide. I slid a folder across my desk. A genuine, lucrative opportunity. A 12-acre parcel of commercial land on the edge of town, perfectly positioned for a new distribution center, appraised at $11 million. I told him I wanted him to acquire it under his own name, through his own LLC, with Hensley Supply guaranteeing the loan, an early inheritance, I called it, before I was, in my words, no longer able to make such decisions clearly. I watched him calculate. I watched him ask, carefully, why I wanted it structured outside the company. I gave him the answer I'd prepared, that I was afraid of making a catastrophic mistake that could hurt the business if my mind kept slipping, that I wanted this one thing protected from whatever came next. It was, I told him, my way of making sure he'd be taken care of no matter what happened to me. He took the bait entirely. Within 2 days, Preston's surveillance caught the calls between Grant, Diane, and Claire. Celebratory, greedy, already planning renovations to my office, already discussing whether to keep the Hensley name on the building at all. And exactly as I'd hoped, Diane advised Grant to cut the company out of the guarantee entirely, worried that a formal board-guaranteed loan would invite scrutiny that might expose BrightPath. She told him to leverage his own home instead, along with BrightPath's fabricated financial statements, to secure the loan independently and keep 100% of the profits away from any future oversight. Grant did exactly as she instructed. Within 4 days, he had mortgaged his own house to the rafters and bound BrightPath as a secondary guarantor, severing Hensley Supply from the transaction entirely, exactly as I needed him to. What Grant did not know, because I had ensured the property records showed only a routine agricultural survey from the 1970s, was that the parcel sat directly above the old runoff channel from a shuttered textile dye plant, a site the state environmental agency had quietly flagged for contamination review 11 months earlier. A review that had just concluded 3 weeks before I ever handed him that folder. The land wasn't a distribution center waiting to happen. It was a designated remediation site, and whoever held the deed would be legally responsible for the full cost of the cleanup. Marjorie confirmed the closing had gone through on a Friday morning. Grant and Diane's shell company were now the sole legal owners of an $11 million liability, secured against Grant's own home. The board meeting arrived on a gray Monday. I dressed the part I'd been playing all week, slightly disheveled, a tremor I let creep into my hands as I took my seat at the head of the table. Grant entered, flanked by his own attorney, wearing the solemn, tragic expression of a man about to perform an unpleasant duty out of love. He gave a long speech about legacy, about how much he respected everything I'd built, and then, voice cracking with rehearsed sorrow, he announced that after months of quiet observation and, he claimed, my own recent request for an evaluation, I had been diagnosed with a rapidly progressing cognitive disorder that left me unfit to continue leading the company. He distributed the falsified medical file to the board. I watched the directors, men and women who had known me for 30 years, pass the pages down the table with quiet, uncomfortable murmurs. Grant invoked the incapacity clause. He asked the board to vote immediately to transfer full executive authority to him. I let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable. Then I reached beneath the table and pressed the small buzzer I'd had installed years earlier for emergencies. The double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Marjorie walked in first, followed by 2 investigators from the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit, and behind them, pale and sweating, clutching a folder to his chest like it might shield him, was Dr. Elias Renner, the psychiatrist Diane had bribed. The room erupted into confused murmurs. I raised my hand for quiet, and 30 years of authority still carried enough weight that the room obeyed. I thanked Grant for his performance. I told the board that Dr. Renner was here under a cooperation agreement, having agreed to testify in full after investigators confronted him with wire evidence of the payment from Bright Path. Marjorie explained the shell company, the $412,000 in fraudulent invoices, and the falsified diagnosis in clear, methodical detail. I watched Grant's face drain of every ounce of color. I watched the investigators step forward and inform the board that they had already executed a warrant on Bright Path's records that morning, and that the $11 million environmental liability tied to the land Grant had just personally guaranteed was now fully his and Diane's responsibility, with Hensley Supply legally and entirely shielded, exactly as the paperwork he himself had insisted on structuring outside the company guaranteed. Grant collapsed back into his chair. I told him plainly that his mansion, mortgaged to the very foundation for a piece of poisoned land, would be foreclosed on within the month, and that his uncle's fraudulent little company would soon be answering to federal auditors as well. That was when the door burst open again. Claire and Diane rushed in, Diane holding a bouquet of celebratory flowers, clearly expecting to walk into a boardroom that already belonged to her son. They froze at the sight of the investigators. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. I told her that I had read the email, the one where she called finding somewhere comfortable for her own father an acceptable price for her husband's ambition. I told her that whatever came next for Grant and Diane was the law's business, but that what she and I had between us, she had broken herself, with her own hands, in writing, 4 months ago. Claire's face crumpled. She began to cry, reaching for me, telling me she loved me, that it had never really felt real until this exact moment. I stepped back before her hands reached mine. I told the board the meeting was adjourned, that Grant's employment with Hensley Supply was terminated effective immediately, and that I would be personally overseeing operations until a permanent successor could be properly vetted, someone who had earned the position rather than schemed for it. I walked out of that boardroom alone, past the stunned faces of employees gathered in the hallway, and drove straight to the cemetery, back to Ruth's grave, where I sat down in the grass beside her headstone and finally allowed myself to weep, not for the company, not for the money, but for the daughter I had lost long before that email chain ever existed. I instructed Marjorie the following week to draft new bylaws, removing the incapacity clause entirely and replacing it with an independent medical board requirement that no single family member could ever manipulate again. I established a scholarship fund in Ruth's name for young people from working families who wanted to start a trade business of their own, the kind of chance nobody gave me when I was sleeping in that truck behind the lumberyard. I am 68 years old, and I lost my wife 3 years ago. And last month I very nearly lost myself to the two people who convinced her memory they loved her too. I did not do this because I stopped loving my daughter. I did it because loving someone has never meant handing them the keys to erase you. If you've ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to protect you, tell me in the comments what town you're writing from tonight, and let me know what you would have done in that boardroom. Hit subscribe if you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes.